Africa. Exactly 500 years ago, and people are the hottest commodity on the market. Alfonso I, King of Congo, whose court looks like a miniature Lisbon, and whose son is the first black Catholic bishop in history, writes a letter to King João III of Portugal. What do you think he's asking for? An end to the trade in human cargo? Mercy for his people? None of the above. Alfonso is filing a complaint, get this, that someone is cutting into his margins. Portuguese merchants from São Tomé, a small island in the Gulf of Guinea, where Portugal grows sugarcane, have started bypassing his monopoly. They trade directly with Congolese aristocracy, flooding the country with European goods in such quantities that vassals now own more than the king himself. And those vassals, hungry for European things, kidnap free people, nobles, the king's own relatives, at night. The hiss of red-hot iron on skin, the stench, the chains. Alfonso wants to regulate this. Not stop it, regulate it. Because he traded too. Historians who translated and published this entire correspondence say it plainly. Alfonso, or rather Mvemba and Zinga, because Alfonso is his baptismal name, waged wars, took captives, shipped them to Portugal. He used the word pesa, peace, like a line item on an invoice. He and Portugal shared a joint monopoly. Congolese law forbade selling one's own subjects, except the merchants from São Tomé couldn't care less about that law. And when the system fell apart and started swallowing Congolese themselves, Alfonso didn't say stop, he said quality control. Portugal responded diplomatically, which is to say, barely at all. São Tomé needed hands. And before we go any further, let me tell you something most people don't know. When I say slave trade, your mind goes to America, cotton, Alabama. Meanwhile, out of 12 million people loaded onto ships, fewer than 400,000 ended up in North America. Less than 4%. The rest, Brazil, the Caribbean, sugar. On Jamaica's sugar plantations, the average life expectancy of an enslaved person after arrival, 7 years. 7. Then the next pesa. America became the center of this story in the public imagination, not because it was the center of the trade, it wasn't, but because it won a civil war and wove it into its national culture. In recent decades, this subject has been amplified mostly there, in pop culture, in media, in film, and to the average person, it might look as though the United States, and probably Columbus, who never even set foot on the American mainland, is responsible for all of it. He isn't. This history is far broader, far older, and far more complicated than anything you've seen in Hollywood. So brace yourself for a journey into the unknown. Right, but to piece this together, we need to start with sugar. A sugarcane plantation. The first production line in history that burned people instead of coal. Harvesting in humid 30-degree heat, cane leaves slicing skin like paper. You swing a machete for hours, and every leaf leaves a thin, burning mark across your forearms. Transport by ox cart along muddy trails. And then the kettles. Open, copper, where boiling sugar slurry bubbles and spits, the heat scalding from a meter away. The smell of boiled cane. Sweet, sickening, disgustingly sweet, the kind that seeps into your clothes and never comes out. People wore out, 7 years in the Caribbean, then the next pecha, the next unit of merchandise. From this single fact springs the triangle trade, the most efficient business model before the Industrial Revolution. Europe needs sugar, sugar needs hands, hands need trade goods. 3 transactions, 1 voyage, full cargo both ways. No modern logistics expert could have designed it better. Castile raided the Canary Islands throughout the 15th century, kidnapping indigenous Guanches and selling them on the continent. It was a testing ground. In Seville, around the year 1500, roughly 10% of the population were enslaved people. The model was ready. It lacked scale. Sugar provided the scale. And the very beginning, the first moment Portuguese sailors seized a person on an African shore, is more accidental than you might think. The year 1441, the coast of Mauritania. A young captain, honestly more of a kid, named Antão Gonçalves, sent by Henry the Navigator, a Portuguese prince. His mission? Hunting seals, Mediterranean monk seals, skins and blubber. He filled the ship, greasy, stinking, salt-crusted bales. And then, on his own initiative, he makes a decision that launches 400 years of human trafficking. Zurara, Henry's court chronicler, recorded his words to the 9 sailors who went ashore with him. Gonçalves says, and I quote, "How fine a thing it would be if they, who had come for such petty merchandise, were lucky enough to bring the first captives before the face of their prince." A fine thing. That night, sand, darkness, ocean wind, the creak of leather sandals on rock. 9 men with swords and crossbows attack a camp on the beach. They seize 2, a camel driver and a black woman enslaved by Berbers. Shortly after, Nuno Tristão arrives, one of Henry's knights, with a caravel, a small, fast-sailing vessel designed for coastal exploration. They interrogate the captured man. The information leads them to a fishing camp. They attack. They seize around 10 people, including a Berber nobleman named Adahu. And here Zurara does something that stops me every time. Instead of describing the Europeans' astonishment, he tries to stand on the other side. What thought could arise in the minds of these men at such a novelty, namely, 2 such audacious youths of complexion and features so foreign to them? A 15th century chronicler who, for a moment, shifts perspective. A year later, Gonçalves returned with the captured Adahu, and the scene on the beach fits no stereotype about helpless savages. 150 men on foot, 35 on horseback, dust, neighing horses, the flash of blades behind the dunes. An ambush. The Portuguese spotted the trap and retreated to their ships. The Berbers sent forward a translator, whom they themselves had previously captured and enslaved. Tactical thinking, counterintelligence, not helpless fishermen. In the end, an exchange. The Berbers negotiated their people's freedom. They gave Gonçalves 10 black enslaved people. They explained the new captives would be black, not of the lineage of Moors, but pagans. The first time a European purchased Africans from African intermediaries. The shift from raid to transaction, from piracy to business model. Raids continued for a few more years. Lanzarote de Freitas, a tax official from Lagos in the Algarve, southern Portugal, not to be confused with Lagos in Nigeria, led a fleet of 6 ships. 235 people seized. The 8th of August, 1444, Zurara described what happened to them. Listen, this scene is hard. Very early in the morning, on account of the heat, Zurara writes. 235 people in an open field. Dust, the stench of sweat, the drone of flies. And the separation of families. Here Zurara's chronicler's detachment cracks. Mothers whose children were torn from their arms. Husbands dragged away from wives. Some tried to drown themselves in the water, others hid under huts. Children, hidden in seaweed, in the wet, fish-reeking seaweed on the shore, pressed into those rotting tangles of seagrass, so that our people, as Zurara writes, might later find them. Henry the Navigator sat on a horse. He watched. He received 46 people, 1/5. Lanzarote was knighted. Good work, good bonus. The racist ideas that Zurara wove into his chronicle, the first systematic defense of the trade built on the concept of black inferiority, were a product of this policy, not its cause. At least that's what one school of historians argues. Business first, ideology second. Another school, and they have strong arguments, says the opposite. Without a pre-existing belief in a hierarchy of peoples, going straight back to Aristotle and his natural slave, no one would have boarded that ship with such confidence. Truth be told, they probably fed off each other. And Henry? He never took part in a single expedition. He sat, he organized. He collected 1/5 of every voyage until the day he died. His biographer from Yale summed him up in a single sentence. In Henry's vocabulary, conversion and enslavement were interchangeable terms. Tristão, the knight who joined Gonçalves on the beach, was killed a few years later in an ambush. The locals had learned to fight back. Buying was safer than raiding. From the 1450s onward, permanent trading posts. Argua I, a small island off the coast of present-day Mauritania. Around 800 people per year. Administration like a corporation. The clerk received 20,000 reish plus one enslaved person, a human being, as part of his compensation package. The Pope blessed it. Formally, pen on parchment. And to be fair to the context, Henry sold it to the Pope as a continuation of the Crusades, a fight against Islam, conversion of pagans, expansion of Christendom. Constantinople would fall a year later, but Ottoman expansion had been underway for decades, and the papacy was living in siege mode. Dum diversas, 1452. Explicit permission to invade, capture, and reduce persons to perpetual servitude. Perpetual. 3 years later, another papal bull added a trade monopoly and excommunication for anyone who broke it. Trade with whomever you like, just don't give them weapons. That Henry happened to collect 1/5 of every voyage, minor detail. License issued. The rest is logistics. And, before anyone in the comments, Europeans did not invent slavery. Mansa Sakura, a former slave, became emperor of the West African Mali Empire at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries. On a sugar plantation? Unthinkable. Slavery in Africa looked different. A captive could own property, could become part of the family. The Scottish explorer and eyewitness Mungo Park, writing in the late 18th century, noted that domestic slaves were treated with kindness, and local law protected them from being sold without cause. But when European demand created an unlimited market, that protection was erased within a single generation. A captive stopped being a member of the clan. He became a pither. The Arab trade across the Sahara lasted 13 centuries. Historians estimate up to 10 million people. Racism was not a European invention. Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Tunisian historian, wrote explicitly about the lesser degree of humanity of black people. The Senegalese anthropologist Tidiane Ndiaye called this Eastern trade the veiled genocide, and when we look at the numbers, we'll understand why. Millions of people imported, yet there is virtually no Afro-Arab diaspora. The reason is simple and ugly: mass castration. The procedure was carried out in primitive conditions, before the crossing of the Sahara, because Islamic law forbade mutilation on Muslim soil. Incidentally, that same Islamic law forbade the enslavement of Muslims, which led to mass conversions as a form of protection. People trapped in the system always look for legal loopholes. Here it was conversion, and a few centuries later in Louisiana, it was the fictitious purchase of a relative. Different continent, different century, same reflex. 3/4 of those castrated died. Those who survived cost 5 times more. So it paid off, because the slave himself cost pennies compared to the price of a eunuch on the destination market. In Zanzibar, enslaved people were brought from stone cellars to the auction square, stood under a spreading tree, beaten with sharp branches, on the legs, the torso, hard, without warning. Those who screamed, cried, fainted, lost value. A higher price went to those who took the blows in silence. Silence was worth more than a scream. Today, on that spot stands an Anglican cathedral, and where the tree once stood, an altar of white marble with a red rim, symbolizing blood. Right, back to the Atlantic. On the coast of West Africa, a group almost nobody talks about had settled: the Lançados. Portuguese settlers who stepped off the ships and stayed. Many of them were crypto-Jews, Jews forced to convert to Christianity, fleeing the Inquisition. In Europe, they had no future. In Africa, they found a niche. They married local women, learned the languages, built trading networks stretching across 3 continents. Their children, Tango Maus, Creole middlemen, people of 2 worlds, who could speak with an African king in the morning and a Portuguese captain in the afternoon. And it was they, not white merchants from Lisbon, who made up over 60% of traders on the Upper Guinea coast. Something needs to be said plainly here, because the subject is a minefield. In 1991, the Nation of Islam published a book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which turned the involvement of crypto-Jewish merchants in the trade into a grand conspiracy. Historians tore it apart. Eli Faber went through customs data, counted voyages, traced investors, and the conclusion is unambiguous. Across the entire Atlantic trade, crypto-Jews accounted for a fraction of a percent of voyages. But in specific ports, Curaçao, a Dutch island in the Caribbean, part of the Caribbean trade, their role was local and significant. The Nation of Islam's manipulation lay in pulling those specific ports out of context and presenting them as the whole picture. The system absorbed anyone with access to capital and contacts on both sides of the ocean. Those excluded in Europe became intermediaries in Africa. The irony is bitter, but irony is not conspiracy. Cadamosto, a Venetian sailor in Henry's service, left an account of a transaction that reads better than any lecture. The coast of Senegal. The ruler, Boudamel, Damel, as the rulers of Cayor were called, one of the kingdoms in present-day Senegal. Cadamosto handed him 7 saddled horses, plus textiles, 300 ducats, and payment did not come at once. Cadamosto had to travel inland to the village of Bisbaror, dozens of kilometers from the coast, and wait. 28 days, nearly a month. Heat, dust, the buzzing of insects, a foreign language all around, a Venetian merchant sitting in an African village waiting for a delivery of people. The Damel delivered personally, arriving with 15 horsemen and 150 on foot, around 100 enslaved people, 9 to 14 people per horse, plus a gift, a 12-year-old girl. Cadamosto records it in a single sentence. 1. That market was controlled by an African ruler. The exchange of horses for people existed here long before the Portuguese arrived. They entered an existing system. They didn't create it, they supercharged it. Incidentally, on the Gambia River, Cadamosto learned that the Mandinka believed the Portuguese were cannibals who bought black people to eat them. Considering what they actually did with them, well, when demand rises, and it rose because sugar consumed hands every 7 years, someone has to meet it. Turns out the most effective sales tool is a musket. There was a moment, and nobody recorded it precisely, because nobody knew at the time that it was a moment, when the first European musket ended up in the hands of an African ruler. And from that point, the continent fell into a trap with no exit. One kingdom gets weapons, attacks its neighbors, takes captives, sells them for more weapons. The neighbors either join the trade or become the merchandise. Nobody can pull out. Alfonso tried. His own nobility did it behind his back. A perpetual motion machine powered by people. Though, to be fair, there were periods when the trade slowed, after conquests, after shifting alliances, after epidemics. The machine wasn't as smooth as the textbook diagram, but it kept going. We have price lists. Because this trade had price lists like any business. In Dahomey, the port of Ouidah, the main gateway of the slave trade in present-day Benin, a healthy man, 12 to 15 muskets plus ammunition. In Senegambia, 40 to 150 iron bars. In Benin, Royal African Company documents, archived at Kew near London, where the British keep state archives. The price of a man in the 1720s, around 160,000 cowrie shells, small white shells from the Indian Ocean that served as currency in West Africa. 50 years later, 250,000. Inflation on human flesh, literally. And here is one of the mechanisms almost nobody knows about. European companies imported cowries en masse from the Indian Ocean, artificially pumping up the money supply, flooding West African markets. This wasn't the only way they destabilized local economies. Alcohol, epidemics, alliances with rivals for the throne. But the currency manipulation was the subtlest. And manillas, copper bracelets, each weighing around 300 grams, exchanged in the port of Calabar at a rate of 8 to 10 per person, which meant, quite simply, that one elephant tusk equaled one manila, and a human being was worth about 8 tusks. From these bracelets, Africans smelted copper into the Benin bronzes, bronze reliefs and sculptures from the royal palace, among the finest works of art on the continent, the same ones that stand in European museums today, cast from the currency used to buy people. In the 18th century, factories in Birmingham produced 3 million manillas a year, 300 tons of metal, except instead of copper, they used lead. Toxic, worthless. From a work of art to toxic waste in a single bracelet. Remember Alfonso? After his death, one generation and everything fell apart. His successors fought for the throne. One grandson expelled the Portuguese from the kingdom. They didn't wait. They founded Angola to the south, 10,000 peccas a year, bypassing Congo entirely. Under Alfonso, those exported were foreign captives, taken in wars. Congolese were protected. After, those distinctions collapsed. A tax, one enslaved person per household per year. And by the mid-17th century, a young man sold his brothers and sisters, and even his mother and father. In the middle of this chaos, Doña Beatriz Quimpavita, a Congolese woman, claims she is possessed by the spirit of St. Anthony, preaches that Jesus was born in Mbanza, Congo, the capital of the Kingdom of Congo, in present-day Angola. She leads thousands of peasants to the abandoned capital. Burned at the stake, fire, smoke over the hill, a crowd in silence. But Congo isn't the only kingdom this system devoured. Further west, Dahomey and Hollywood. In 2022, the film The Woman King came out, starring Viola Davis. Beautiful story. Critics wrote about representation and the power of African feminism. Audiences wept. The archives say something different. And before we get into the raid scene, something needs to be said about what Dahomey's elites knew. Because there's a convenient myth that African traders didn't know what happened to people on the other side of the ocean. Ordinary people probably didn't know. The Mandinka on the Gambia River thought Europeans were cannibals, remember? But the elites? Dahomey sent at least 5 official embassies to Portugal and Brazil in 1750, 95, 1805, 1811, and 1818. Diplomats travelled between Lisbon and Salvador de Bahia. Portugal paid for their lodging, gifts and correspondence were exchanged. King Adandozan, Dahomey's ruler at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, wrote letters to the Queen of Portugal, in which, by the way, he commented on the Napoleonic Wars and expressed regret that he couldn't assist the Portuguese royal family in their fight against the French. Not an ignorant savage, a diplomat with full geopolitical awareness. On the Gold Coast, local rulers sent their children onto European ships, into forts, sometimes to Europe and America, to learn the business from the inside. They even had clauses written into their contracts with the Dutch and British. Procedures for buying back allied countrymen if they accidentally ended up on a ship. The elites knew, not everything, but enough, and they kept trading. Before dawn, maybe 4, maybe 5 in the morning, a unit of Agoji surrounds a village. The Agoji are Dahomey's all-female military corps. Europeans called them Amazons. 6,000 warriors in formation, but a raid might involve 100, 200. Silence. Positions taken. The signal. They set fire to the huts from the windward side. Dry thatch roofs catch in seconds. Fire leaps from roof to roof. Smoke, screaming. People run outside into the darkness, into panic, straight into the ambush. Seizing those who can walk. Decapitating those who resist. Heads carried to the king as trophies, decorating the walls of Dahomey's cities. The rest, the old, the sick, the too small, left behind. Dalzell, British governor of Ouidah, and Forbes, a British naval officer, both eyewitnesses in 2 different decades, describe this independently. The Agoji did not fight against the trade. They were its most effective instrument. They were trained from childhood. 10-year-old girls, kidnapped, given up by fathers, taken from the enslaved population. Training, 400 meters of acacia thorn barricades bristling with 2-inch spikes, charged barefoot at a run, blood on the sand, the toughest rewarded with belts made from those same thorns. Initiation tests, forced executions of captives. The Reapers unit fought with 3-foot razors held in both hands. The annual Shwetanu, the yearly business with heads. 40,000 citizens camped near the palace at Abomi, in the stench of drying blood, thick, metallic, hanging over the city like fog. Close to 4,000 executions at a single ceremony. Kingdoms that failed to deliver captives lost their rulers. When the British pushed for abolition, King Gezo of Dahomey, who had deposed that same Adandozan, refused. When the trade weakened, Dahomey shifted enslaved people to its own palm oil plantations. The system adapted. The Ashanti, same mechanism. Armies kidnapped people, sold them for weapons to conquer further. 2 revenue streams from one machine. Stop. Who was catching these people? Not the Europeans. Europeans stood on the coast and waited. Life expectancy of a European in Africa under 1 year. Malaria. Europeans supplied weapons, money, ships. The catching, that was done by Africans. A partnership. Unequal, but a partnership. And now the part almost nobody tells. Hollywood starts from the ship. Textbooks start from the plantation. But what happened before, hundreds of kilometers from village to coast? That's the narrative black hole. Equiano. Author of an autobiography from 1789, one of the most important documents of the era. Incidentally, historians debate whether he was born in Africa, as he writes, or in South Carolina. If the latter, part of this account is literary reconstruction. It doesn't diminish its value, but it's worth knowing. Equiano was 11 years old. He was alone with his sister at home. The adults had gone to work in the fields. 2 men jumped the compound wall, gagged them, took them, running through the forest before anyone could react. He was separated from his sister that same day. He never saw her again. Then, months. Columns of people forced to march. In English, coffles, from the Arabic kafila, caravan. Wooden Y-shaped yokes on the neck, secured with an iron pin that couldn't be opened, attached to the yoke of the next person. The creak of wood, the rhythmic crunch of bare feet in dust, the heavy breathing of hundreds. They deliberately tied families together, mother beside child, because fear for loved ones paralyzed more effectively than shackles. The march lasted weeks, through jungle, savanna, in heat, rain, mud. Those who collapsed were left behind. The German traveller and physician Nachtigall, who crossed the Sahara in the 1870s, estimated, for every one who arrived, 3 were lost along the way. And that was the trans-Saharan route. On Atlantic routes, we don't know. Nobody kept statistics before loading. These are the people in no database. Not in the 12 million loaded, not in the 2 million who drowned. They died earlier, in the forest, on the trail, with a yoke on their neck. Those who made it, barracoons, temporary port prisons, wooden enclosures under open sky, bamboo palisades, weeks of waiting for a ship, rain, sun, no roof, no latrine. And silence, because by this point, people had stopped screaming. Equiano describes the moment he first saw the ocean, a ship at anchor. People of such different complexions, long hair and language, a boiling copper cauldron on deck. He was convinced he had entered a world of evil spirits who intended to eat him. Then the hold, the stench, the suffocation, barely room to turn over, sores from chains, tubs of excrement that children fell into and nearly choked. Equiano refused to eat. He was beaten for it. He tried to jump overboard. He was watched. He wanted to die. They wouldn't let him. From barracoons to the fort. Processing procedure. And here again the corporate language creeps in, because that's exactly what it looked like. Stripped naked. A Dutch trade agent at Elmina wrote, "Their African masters strip them of everything." Inspection of condition, teeth, eyes, muscles, rejects separated. Accepted, branding. Red-hot iron stamped with company initials burned into shoulders, chests, shoulder blades. The hiss of skin under metal, the stench of scorching iron. Screams in stone dungeons saturated with excrement. Cape Coast Castle, a British fort a few dozen kilometers from Elmina, on the same Ghanaian coast. Upstairs, an Anglican church. Weekly prayers, hymn singing, sunlight through stained glass. Below, the dungeons. The governor lived above them, prayed above them. Through openings in the floor, screams. Gorée, a small island off the coast of present-day Dakar in Senegal. Honestly, I have to say something unpopular here. Maison des Esclaves, Obama, the Pope, Mandela, the door of no return. The curator Boubacar Joseph Ndiaye, who from the 1970s built this place into a sanctuary of memory. The problem, the slave voyages database, over 36,000 documented voyages, indicates that most departures from Senegambia were from other ports. Gore is a metaphor, a powerful one, but I'm not sure a powerful metaphor has to be a powerful fact. And here, the door. A narrow passage through the wall, stone damp from the sea breeze, opening onto the ocean, and beyond the door, boats, and beyond the boats, a ship. From this point on, everything that came before turns out to have been merely the prologue. There's a drawing, a schematic of a ship, people laid out symmetrically, lying on their backs, packed tight, like sardines in a tin, except sardines don't breathe. The ship, Brooks, 482 people, 7 feet and 2 square inches per head. The most famous abolitionist poster in the world. And that drawing lied. Not on purpose. It was produced after the first British law limiting cargo capacity, so it showed the version after regulation, the legally permissible version, the version for which they no longer hanged the captain. The reality before the law, over 2.5 million people transported in conditions that even that drawing couldn't show. On ships like the French Marie Seraphique, the median space per person, just under 1 square meter. On 45% of voyages, even less. People didn't lie on their backs, there wasn't room. They lay on their sides, nested spoons like in a drawer, one pressed tight against the next, the right leg chained to the left leg of the neighbor, knees wedged into the companion's space, in their own vomit, below deck without ventilation. Darkness, humidity, the heat of bodies impossible to separate from your own because there isn't a centimeter to move away, the neighbor's breath on the back of your neck, a chain cutting into the ankle in rhythm with the waves, the clank of iron against wood, monotonous, unending, for hours, days, weeks. Water rations, around 700 milliliters per day. To picture that, just under 2 cans of Coke. In that heat, in that airlessness, in that stench, just under 2 cans of water for the entire day, plus dry beans and rice. 26% of the cargo were children. Captains calculated how many people to pack in so that profit exceeded losses. Losses of around 10% were an operating cost. Corpses were thrown overboard on an ongoing basis. They kept ledgers. Upstairs, bookkeeping. Below, people. Dysentery, the flux, bloody diarrhea, the primary killer. Scurvy, purulent conjunctivitis leading to blindness, the smell of a slave ship. Sailors' reports describe a stench so thick it hit you in the face before you spotted the ship on the horizon. The routes of thousands of ships created oceanic superhighways of discarded corpses. Shark migration patterns in the Atlantic changed because their feeding routes aligned with slaving routes. A documented biological phenomenon, not a metaphor. Dancing the slaves. Under threat of the lash, people were forced up on deck and made to perform rhythmic jumps, in chains, to maintain their muscles, to maintain their price. Captains called it preventative care. They were made to play drums, European violins, the akonting, a West African ancestor of the banjo. Chains clinking in rhythm with forced music, something that on the surface looked like cultural preservation, in reality, aerobics for live merchandise under threat of the whip. And a fact that is perverse. The annual mortality rate of European sailors on slave ships, 230 per thousand. Of the enslaved, 83 per thousand. Sailors died proportionally more often than the cargo, mostly from malaria and fever on the African coast, where ships sat for weeks waiting for a full load. Most of those sailors were the poorest of the poor from port slums, people for whom this voyage was the only work available. The system ate them too. More slowly, but it ate them. On average, every 10th ship, an organized mutiny. The ship Don Carlos, the year 1700. Barbeau Jr., a sailor on a French slave ship, describes it in a report with terrifying, dry honesty. The captives used knives carelessly left by the crew, and broken hinges, pieces of iron hardware from doors, improvised weapons from whatever was at hand. They rushed the crew. One sailor, 15 stab wounds, the bosun's leg muscles cut to the bone, the cook's throat slashed to the windpipe. And when the crew opened fire, the captives did not surrender. They jumped overboard. Barbeau writes that they showed not the slightest regard for their own lives. They preferred to drown. Nets on the sides, woven from hemp rope so that anyone who jumped would bounce back onto the deck. It wasn't enough. Because suicides at sea, researchers have linked them to the cosmology of the Akan people from present-day Ghana. Some of the enslaved believed that death at sea meant the return of the soul home. A leap into the ocean was not desperation, it was an act of will, a metaphysical choice. I reject your ship, I reject your chains, I'm going back. And the crew found a countermeasure. To discourage the others, they mutilated the bodies of those who killed themselves before throwing them overboard. They chopped off heads, limbs, to convince the remaining captives that their soul would return home without hands, without legs, without a head. Abu Bakr al-Sadiq, a Muslim scholar and translator from present-day Mali, an educated man who knew Arabic and several local languages. Captured during one of the wars inland, they tore off his robes, bound him with ropes, threw him below deck. He ended up on a ship beside people whom, had fate gone differently, he himself might once have sold. The machine ate even those who fed it. And now, Zong. This part needs to slow down. The ship Zong, a syndicate belonging to a Liverpool merchant named Gregson. Captain, Luke Collingwood, a former ship surgeon, which is staggering because this is a doctor who is about to throw people overboard. Voyage to Jamaica. Extended, navigation problems, water running out. Collingwood makes a decision. 132 people, men, women, children, thrown alive into the sea, one after another. A scream swallowed by the sound of waves. Why? A clause in the insurance policy, the perils clause, which defined what the insurer would pay for. The enslaved, in the eyes of the law, movable property, cargo. If they died on board from disease, the loss fell on the owner. If the captain threw them overboard as jettison, the deliberate discarding of cargo to save the ship, liability shifted to the insurer. Living people had to hit the water as merchandise, not as people, to qualify for compensation. The trial. London. Gregson versus Gilbert. Note, this was not a murder trial. It was an insurance dispute. The first jury, verdict in favour of the syndicate. The insurer must pay for the drowned. Appeal. The judge, Lord Mansfield, Lord Chief Justice, the highest judge in England. The same Lord Mansfield who raised in his own home a dark-skinned aristocrat named Dido Elizabeth Bell, daughter of a British military officer and an enslaved woman. They made a film about her, a beautiful story of love and justice. And in court, the Zong case was not about taking lives. There was no indictment. The case was about whether the insurer had to pay compensation for lost cargo. And Mansfield ruled, this massacre must be considered as if horses had been thrown overboard. Horses. Mansfield, who has Dido at home, and in court, 132 people are horses thrown overboard. Let that hang. Saidiya Hartman, professor at Columbia, one of the most important scholars of slavery, wrote something that hasn't left me since the moment I read it. She speaks of the difference between death camps and slave ships. The purpose of death camps was killing. The purpose of ships was not killing. The purpose was profit. Death was simply an operating cost, something the accountant deducted at the end of the month, a byproduct of commerce. And this machine, this entire system, did not run on hatred. It ran on spreadsheets, on the calculation that it was cheaper to lose 10% of the cargo than to improve conditions. Hartman calls it the afterlife of slavery, because those calculations didn't disappear. They changed form. So, what did this machine look like from the inside? Let's start with a name. The first English slave ship, a galleon loaned to John Hawkins, English merchant and privateer, by the Crown. Its name, Jesus of Lubeck. Jesus of Lubeck. A ship on which people were kidnapped bore the name of Christ. If I'd made that up, no one would believe it. The Triangle Trade. 1 voyage, 0 deadheading. A merchant in Liverpool loads the ship with rum, the smell of molasses, wood soaked in alcohol, textiles, weapons. Sails to Africa. Exchange for people at the price lists we already know. Sails to America. Sale at auction. The sweat and dust of the yard, the crack of the hammer, the sound of the winning bid. Loads sugar, tobacco, cotton. Returns. Profit on every leg. 3 transactions, 1 voyage. Full cargo in every direction. And we have a specific voyage, because in the archives of the Rhode Island Historical Society, there sits a letter. The captain of one of their ships, Jeremiah Diamond, writes to James de Wolfe the 1st of April 1796, quote, "This will inform you of my arrival in this port safe, with 78 well slaves, 78 healthy enslaved people. He lost 2 en route from Africa. I shall do the best I can, and without other orders, load with molasses and return to Bristol. I'll load up with molasses and head back to Bristol. 1 letter, 2 sentences, the entire triangle trade." The de Wolfes of Rhode Island, a small state on the east coast of the USA, the biggest slave trading dynasty in the country's history. 88 voyages over 50 years, 3 generations of one family, around 12,000 people transported. They owned their own rum distillery, their own bank, their own insurance company that insured their own ships. James de Wolfe, the head of the family, became a US senator. When he died, he was the 2nd wealthiest man in the country. One Christmas, he gave his wife 2 African children, Adju and Paulidor, as a gift. Family records mention them with affection. Adju was buried in the family cemetery, beside the masters. Affection for their property. Lloyd's of London. They insured ships from which people were thrown overboard. The Zong was with them. This wasn't the fringe. This was the core. Liverpool, at the start of the 18th century, a fishing village, 5,000 people. 100 years later, the 2nd city of the British Empire. People were auctioned at the public exchange. Over 40% of the European trade passed through this one port. Bristol. Edward Colston, a 17th century merchant and trader, used money from the slave trade to build monuments, churches, schools, almshouses. Colston's statue stood for 125 years, erected in 1895, when the people of Bristol decided to honour their benefactor, conveniently forgetting where his money came from. In 2020, protests after the death of George Floyd, a crowd pulled the statue off its pedestal. Someone painted BLM on its face. Then they threw it into the River Avon. A splash. Today, Colston lies in a museum, dirty, with the writing on his face, as an exhibit. Bristol's manufacturers cast brass manillas, the same bracelets used to buy people. Fry's chocolate, yes, that Fry, built its fortune on cacao grown by enslaved labour. From that money rose the University of Bristol. Nantes, Newport, Geneva, the list goes on. Researchers from University College London traced the genealogies of directors at Barclays and Royal Bank of Scotland. 18 of them benefited from compensation paid for the abolition of slavery. Because here's a fact you might want to sit down for. When Britain abolished slavery, and it's worth mentioning that this didn't happen by itself, it was the result of decades of abolitionist struggle, of Quakers, of people like Wilberforce and Clarkson who genuinely believed this was a crime. So when Parliament finally voted, the government did not pay compensation to the enslaved. It paid compensation to the owners. For the loss of property, £20 million, 40% of the national budget at the time. And the debt taken out to cover it, taxpayers were paying it off until 2015. The year 2015, not 1815. In Dutch archives, records survive from Suriname, processed by the central bank in Amsterdam. Magdalena, mulatto and pregnant. Francis is old and of little use. Jan is crooked and cross-eyed. That's what human bookkeeping looked like, a column in a ledger from behind a desk. Anthony Johnson, an Angolan brought to Virginia as an enslaved person, who somehow, honestly, nobody knows exactly how, gained his freedom. He acquired 250 acres of land, and he went to court over his worker, John Kaiser, also black. Kaiser begged that his contract had expired and he was a free man. The court ruled that Kaiser belonged to Johnson, for life, the first such civil ruling in Virginia in 1655. 15 years earlier, another black man, John Punch, had been sentenced to lifelong servitude, but that ruling was in a criminal case for attempting to escape. The difference might seem legalistic, but in practice, Johnson opened a door through which millions would later pass. A black man made another person permanent property in a civil court. The system had no skin color. It had a price, at least at the start. By the end of the 17th century, the colonies voted through laws that cemented skin color as the sole condition for lifelong enslavement. Johnson could be an owner, his grandchildren could not. The census of 1830. Nearly 4,000 free black people owned close to 13,000 enslaved people. Before anyone in the comments starts citing this as proof of anything, context. A large portion of those cases involve Louisiana and South Carolina, where free people of color, Creoles, bought their own relatives to protect them from being sold to strangers. The law didn't allow you to simply free a person. You had to own them. But it also had traps that even free people couldn't escape. When the trade became illegal, the return on investment, what finance people call ROI, jumped to 91%. Because when most captains feared the gallows, those who risked it could set their own prices. At that kind of return, no ban was enough. Demographers calculated the effects on the African side, and the numbers are staggering. The removal of young, productive people halted the continent's natural population growth for over 100 years. And when the trade was formally banned, the percentage of children in the cargo jumped to 40%. Because adult men were in short supply, the system adapted by loading more children. And when Europe abolished the trade, abolition itself became a pretext. People liberated by the British Royal Navy didn't receive freedom. They received apprenticeships, shipped to the Caribbean, to the same plantations, for a period not exceeding 14 years, often longer. A different label, the same raw material, people. The toll. 400 years of trade, 12.5 million loaded, 10.5 million arrived, 2 million on the ocean floor, plus those nobody counted, the marches, the yokes, the trails, the forest. North America, fewer than 400,000, under 4%. Brazil, nearly 5 million. The Caribbean, 4 million. And those 400,000? A few generations later, 4 million enslaved people in the USA, because America didn't import on the scale Brazil did. America bred them. And I should say that bred is my word, not a scholarly term, because historians speak of natural increase of the enslaved population. But the effect was the same. The USA was the only plantation society in the Western Hemisphere where the enslaved population grew naturally. More were born than died. Brazil imported 6 times more people than the USA and had a smaller enslaved population. Owners in America calculated, if you kept people healthy enough, they'd reproduce and you'd steal their children, or sell them, or leave them in the fields. No different from cattle. Except cattle don't write autobiographies. And now, reparations. Because this topic hangs over this entire history, and pretending it doesn't would be dishonest. In 2001, the UN convened a conference against racism in Durban, South Africa. African nations demanded official apologies from former slaving powers, and compensation. The US and Israel withdrew, officially over the conflict about Zionism and Palestine, but the reparations question hung over the entire event. The final declaration recognized the slave trade as something that would have been a crime against humanity if today's law had been in force. But it wasn't, so, you understand, technically. 20 years later at the anniversary, the US, Britain, Canada again didn't show. And a few days ago, literally this week, the UN General Assembly voted on a resolution calling for reparations for the slave trade. The US voted against. Britain abstained. Most of Europe abstained. And I, to be honest, don't think reparations are feasible. Not because the ledger is closed. It isn't closed. 400 years, millions of people, a continent whose demographic development was set back over 100 years. The fortunes of European banks, universities, cities built on the trade in bodies, British taxpayers paying compensation to owners, not to the enslaved, until 2015. No, the problem is simpler and worse. There's nobody to pay them to. Because you just heard about 4,000 free black people who themselves owned enslaved people. About kings of Dahomey who sent ambassadors to Brazil to negotiate better prices for human merchandise. About Berbers who sold Goncalves the first black captives. About crypto-Jewish merchants in Curaçao. Who pays whom? By what key? Skin color? Because if by skin color, you're ignoring half this history. And the millions of Slavs sold to the Ottoman Empire. The very word slave comes from Slav. Has that expired? And slavery in Asia, in the Arab world, which lasted longer than the Atlantic trade. And finally, the UN resolution calls the transatlantic trade the gravest crime against humanity. Honestly, if we're counting by the number of victims, I can think of several examples that dwarf it. But that's a topic for a separate episode, and I don't want to close it with a single sentence. Reparations are a question you can't answer with a check, and people who claim you can, on either side, either don't know the material or they're ignoring it. Cape Coast Castle, the coast of Ghana, today. A layer of compacted sediment on the dungeon floors, centuries of sweat, excrement, blood, trampled under thousands of feet into a crust as hard as concrete. And inside those dungeons, the shrine of Nana Tabir, a deity of the Fante people. His rock shrine stood here before the Europeans built the castle around it. The dungeons were carved from the same rock that was his dwelling, and to this day, a priest comes and performs the rituals. The door of no return. A wide passage through the wall opening onto the beach, onto a fishing village, onto the ocean beyond. Light that hits your eyes after the darkness of the dungeons. The smell of fried fish from the stalls, because today, just beyond those doors, fishermen mend their nets. And that's the end of today's episode. If you enjoyed it, great. If not, thank you for listening all the way through. Let me know in the comments whether you knew the trade looked like this, and what you think about reparations. Are they owed or not? If so, to whom, and how do you resolve it? Hit the thumbs up, subscribe if you don't want to miss the next episodes. Take care, and see you next time.